The diner's neon sign flickered, casting a red glow over the cracked pavement where Aisha Coleman sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Coffee dripped from her blouse, the bitter scent mixing with the humid Georgia air. She didn't flinch, didn't scream, didn't even raise her voice. Her silence was a blade, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the chaos around her. Officer Daniel Hargrove stood over her, his face flushed red, the empty styrofoam cup still clutched in his hand. The crowd outside the diner was growing, phones raised, capturing every second of the scene. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, some outraged, some confused, all waiting for Aisha to react. But she didn't. She just sat there, her dark eyes locked on Hargrove's, calm as a still lake under a storm. It had started so small. Aisha, 32, a paralegal who'd moved to this sleepy town of Willow Creek to escape the noise of Atlanta, was a regular at Millie's Diner. She came every Thursday evening, always alone, always with a book, always ordering a black coffee and a slice of pecan pie. She kept to herself, her presence quiet but steady, like a shadow that never demanded attention. Hargrove, a 15-year veteran of the Willow Creek Police Department, knew her face but not her story. To him, she was just another customer, another black woman in a town where tensions simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but ever present. That evening, the diner was packed. Families, truckers, and locals filled the booths, their chatter loud over the clink of silverware. Aisha sat at the counter. Her copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God open, her coffee untouched. Hargrove was off duty, sitting 2 stools down with a couple of his buddies from the precinct, their laughter sharp and careless. The air felt heavy, charged with something Aisha couldn't name but could feel, like static before a lightning strike. She'd overheard their conversation, crude jokes about keeping the town in line, laced with words that made her stomach twist. She didn't look up, didn't engage. She never did. But Hargrove noticed her. Maybe it was the way she sat, so composed, so unbothered by their noise. Maybe it was the book, its worn cover a quiet rebellion against their ignorance. Or maybe it was just the color of her skin in a town where some still clung to old divides. Whatever it was, he leaned toward her, his voice low but dripping with venom. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he said, loud enough for his friends to chuckle. Aisha didn't respond. She turned a page, her fingers steady. That's when he grabbed his coffee cup and poured it over her, deliberate and slow, the liquid splashing across her blouse and book. The diner went silent. "You gonna say something now?" Hargrove taunted, expecting a reaction, tears, anger, anything. But Aisha just closed her book, set it beside her, and looked up at him. Her gaze wasn't angry or afraid. It was something else, something that made Hargrove's smirk falter for a split second. The crowd outside had started to form, drawn by the commotion, their phones already recording. Someone shouted, "What the hell? Hargrove!" Another voice, shakier, called for the manager. But Aisha didn't move. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any scream. Hargrove's buddies laughed nervously, trying to diffuse the tension. "Come on, Dan, let's go," one said, tugging at his arm. But Hargrove wasn't done. He leaned closer, his voice a hiss. "You think you can just sit there, acting all high and mighty? This ain't your town." Aisha's lips parted, but not to speak. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, then stood, brushing coffee from her skirt. The crowd parted as she walked to the curb and sat down, her movements graceful, almost ceremonial. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. The manager, a wiry man named Carl, burst out of the diner, his face pale. "Officer, what's going on here?" he stammered, glancing between Hargrove and Aisha. Hargrove shrugged, tossing the empty cup into a nearby trash can. "Just teaching her a lesson," he said, his tone casual, as if he'd done nothing more than swat a fly. Carl looked at Aisha, who met his gaze with that same unnerving calm. "Ma'am, you okay?" he asked. She nodded once, her voice soft but clear. "I'm fine." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Carl step back. The crowd was buzzing now, their voices a mix of outrage and disbelief. A teenage girl in the back was live streaming, her shaky voice narrating the scene. "This cop just poured coffee on her for no reason," she said, her phone trembling in her hands. Hargrove turned, his face hardening as he realized the situation was slipping out of his control. "Go home, all of you," he barked, but the crowd didn't budge. They were waiting, just like Aisha, for what came next. What Hargrove didn't know, what no one in Willow Creek knew, was that Aisha Coleman wasn't just a quiet paralegal. Her family was a force, a legacy woven into the fabric of American history, one that reached far beyond this small town. And as the crowd grew louder, as the phones kept recording, the weight of what he'd done began to settle over him like a storm cloud. He'd picked the wrong woman to mess with. By the time the first police cruiser pulled up, its lights cutting through the dusk, the crowd outside Millie's diner had doubled. Aisha remained on the curb, her coffee-stained blouse clinging to her skin, her book now tucked under her arm. She hadn't said another word since telling Carl she was fine, but her presence drew every eye. Officer Hargrove stood a few feet away, his confidence fraying as he barked orders at the onlookers to disperse. They didn't listen. The air was electric, charged with the kind of tension that could spark a fire with a single wrong move. Two more officers stepped out of the cruiser, their faces tight with unease. One, a young rookie named Torres, glanced at Aisha, then at Hargrove, his brow furrowing. "What's going on, Dan?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Hargrove waved him off, his tone dismissive. "Just a misunderstanding. She's making a scene." Torres's eyes lingered on Aisha, who met his gaze with that same unshakable calm. She wasn't making a scene. She was the still center of a growing storm. The truth about Aisha began to surface in whispers among the crowd. Someone recognized her last name, Coleman. "Isn't she related to that lawyer?" A woman muttered to her friend, her voice hushed but urgent. "The one who took down that corrupt judge in Atlanta." Another voice chimed in, louder. "Her brother's a big-shot activist, too. Works with the ACLU or something." The murmurs spread, each one adding weight to the moment, like stones piling onto a scale. Hargrove didn't hear them, or if he did, he didn't care. He was too busy trying to control the narrative, his voice rising as he addressed the crowd. "This is nothing. Go home." But Aisha wasn't just a name in Willow Creek. Her family was a legacy. Her father, Dr. Marcus Coleman, was a civil rights attorney who'd spent decades dismantling systemic injustices in Georgia's courts. Her older brother, Jamal, was a national figure, a voice for reform whose speeches had rallied thousands. Aisha, the youngest, had always chosen a quieter path, working behind the scenes as a paralegal, her brilliance subtle but undeniable. She didn't flaunt her family's influence, didn't need to. It was in her blood, in the way she carried herself, in the way she sat on that curb, unmoved by Hargrove's taunts. Torres approached Aisha, crouching to her level. "Ma'am, do you want to press charges?" he asked, his voice careful, as if he sensed the weight of the moment. Aisha tilted her head, considering the question. For the first time, a faint smile curved her lips. Not yet, she said softly. But I'd like to speak to your supervisor. Torres hesitated, then nodded, stepping away to radio his sergeant. Hargrove scoffed, loud enough for everyone to hear. You think you're going to play that card? This is my town. Aisha's smile didn't waver. It's not about cards, officer, she said, her voice steady, cutting through the noise like a blade. It's about consequences. The crowd hushed, her words hanging in the air. Hargrove's face twitched, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this, not by someone who looked like Aisha, who carried herself with a quiet power he couldn't understand. The sergeant, a grizzled man named Whitaker, arrived minutes later, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene. He'd seen the videos already. Someone in the crowd had uploaded the footage to X, and it was spreading like wildfire. Hargrove, step back, Whitaker ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Hargrove hesitated, his jaw tight, but he complied, moving to the side as Whitaker approached Aisha. Ms. Coleman, I'm sorry about this. Can you tell me what happened? Aisha recounted the incident with precision, her voice calm but unyielding. She didn't embellish, didn't exaggerate. She described Hargrove's words, the coffee, the way he'd leaned in to intimidate her. The crowd listened, some nodding, others recording. Whitaker's face darkened as she spoke, his eyes flicking to Hargrove, who was now pacing near the cruiser, his hands clenched into fists. When Aisha finished, Whitaker nodded. We'll handle this, ma'am. Do you need anything right now? I need you to do your job, Aisha said simply. The words weren't accusatory, but they carried a weight that made Whitaker straighten. He turned to Torres, muttering something about taking Hargrove back to the station. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Aisha didn't react. She stood, brushing off her skirt, and walked toward her car, the book still tucked under her arm. The crowd parted for her, their voices a mix of admiration and awe. As she drove away, the reality of what had happened began to sink in for Hargrove. He'd acted on impulse, driven by a mix of arrogance and prejudice, thinking Aisha was just another nobody he could push around. But the whispers about her family were growing louder, and the videos were everywhere. By morning, the story would be national news, and Hargrove's name would be at the center of it. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just lit a match that would burn his career to the ground. The next morning, Willow Creek was a town on edge. The video of Officer Hargrove pouring coffee on Aisha had gone viral, shared thousands of times on X, with hashtags like Justice for Aisha and Willow Creek Racism trending nationwide. News vans lined the main street, their cameras trained on the diner, now cordoned off with yellow tape as if it were a crime scene. Aisha's name was on everyone's lips, but she was nowhere to be found. She'd gone home, changed out of her stained clothes, and turned off her phone. She didn't need to see the headlines to know what was coming. At the police station, Hargrove sat in a cramped office, his badge on the desk in front of him. Sergeant Whitaker stood across from him, his arms crossed, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Do you have any idea what you've done? Whitaker asked, his voice low but sharp. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, trying to project confidence, but his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly. It was a joke, Sarge. She was acting all high and mighty, ignoring me. I just reacted. A joke. Whitaker slammed his hand on the desk, making Hargrove flinch. You poured coffee on a woman for no reason, in front of a crowd, and now it's all over the internet. You think this is a game? Hargrove opened his mouth to argue, But Whitaker cut him off. Her name is Aisha Coleman. Her father's Marcus Coleman. Ring any bells? Hargrove's face went pale. He'd heard the name before, some big-shot lawyer who'd made headlines years ago. But he hadn't connected the dots. Not until now. Outside, the town was fracturing. Protesters gathered in front of the station, their signs demanding Hargrove's badge. No justice. No peace. They chanted, their voices echoing through the streets. Some were locals. Others had driven in from nearby cities, drawn by the video and the story of a black woman who'd faced down a cop with nothing but her composure. Counter-protesters showed up too, a smaller group, their signs defending Hargrove, calling the incident a misunderstanding. The tension was palpable, like a taut wire ready to snap. Aisha, meanwhile, was at her small apartment, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. Her brother, Jamal, had called her at dawn, his voice urgent. Aisha, you okay? I saw the video. I'm coming down there. She'd told him to stay in D.C., that she could handle it, but he was already on a plane. Her father was next, his voice calm but heavy with concern. You don't have to fight this alone, he said. Aisha smiled faintly, stirring her tea. I'm not fighting, Dad. I'm just being. She'd always been the quiet one in her family, the one who listened more than she spoke, who worked behind the scenes while her father and brother took the spotlight. But she wasn't weak. Her strength was in her restraint, in her ability to stand firm without raising her voice. She'd learned it from her mother, who'd passed away when Aisha was a teenager. Silence can be louder than a scream, her mother used to say. Aisha had taken those words to heart, and now they were her armor. Back at the station, Hargrove was suspended pending an investigation, but he wasn't going quietly. He'd called his union rep, demanding protection, claiming he was being targeted by woke activists. He didn't see what he'd done as wrong, not really. To him, Aisha was a symbol of everything he resented, people who didn't know their place, who challenged his authority without saying a word. He didn't know her family's history, didn't know the battles they'd fought, the cases they'd won. All he saw was a black woman who'd refused to bow. The confrontation came that afternoon. Aisha agreed to meet with Whitaker at the station, not to press charges, but to give a formal statement. She walked in, her head high, her expression serene. Hargrove was there, against Whitaker's orders, waiting in the hallway. When he saw her, his face twisted with anger. You think you're going to ruin me? He snapped, stepping toward her. Aisha stopped, her eyes locking onto his. The air between them crackled, every officer in the room tensing. I'm not here to ruin you, Aisha said, her voice soft but unyielding. You did that yourself. Hargrove lunged forward, but Torres grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Enough, Dan, Torres shouted. Aisha didn't flinch. She walked past him, her steps steady, and sat down with Whitaker to give her statement. Every word she spoke was measured, deliberate, a quiet indictment of Hargrove's actions. By the time she finished, Whitaker's face was grim. He knew this wasn't just about a cup of coffee. It was about a town, a system, a history. As Aisha left the station, the protesters cheered, their voices a wave of support. She didn't acknowledge them, didn't need to. She'd already made her stand, not with shouts or fists, but with the quiet power of her presence. Hargrove watched from the window, his career unraveling with every step she took. The fallout was swift and merciless. By the end of the week, Hargrove's name was plastered across every major news outlet, from CNN to local blogs. The video had been dissected, analyzed, and debated. with pundits arguing over whether it was an act of overt racism or a heat-of-the-moment mistake. X was a battleground, with thousands of posts condemning Hargrove and just as many defending him, claiming Aisha had provoked him by ignoring him. But the truth was undeniable. The image of a white cop pouring coffee on a black woman, who responded with nothing but calm, was a spark that ignited a national conversation. Aisha stayed out of the spotlight. She went to work at the law firm, filed documents, and answered emails, her routine unchanged. But the world around her was shifting. Her phone buzzed with messages from reporters, activists, even strangers offering support. She ignored them all, focusing on her work, her book, her quiet life. Her brother, Jamal, arrived in Willow Creek on Friday, his presence drawing even more attention. He was a force of nature, tall, charismatic, his voice booming as he addressed the growing crowd outside the diner. "This isn't just about my sister," he said, his words broadcast live on X. "This is about every black person who's been disrespected, dismissed, or dehumanized. We're done staying silent." The town was splitting apart. Protests grew larger, with marchers filling the streets, their signs demanding Hargrove's firing and broader reforms. The counter-protesters pushed back, their rhetoric growing uglier, accusing Aisha of playing the race card. The diner became a symbol, its parking lot a battleground for competing narratives. Millie, the owner, issued a public apology, but it did little to quell the anger. Some locals stopped coming. Others doubled down, turning the diner into a makeshift rallying point for Hargrove supporters. Hargrove himself was unraveling. Holed up in his apartment, he avoided the news but couldn't escape the reality. His suspension was now indefinite, and the department was under pressure to fire him. His union rep warned him the case was a lost cause. The video was too damning, the public outcry too loud. "You messed with the wrong family," the rep said, shaking his head. Hargrove didn't respond. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, the way Aisha had looked at him, her silence louder than any accusation. It gnawed at him, not because he felt guilty, but because he couldn't understand why she hadn't fought back. At the law firm, Aisha met with her father, who'd driven up from Atlanta. Marcus Coleman was in his 60s, his hair gray but his presence commanding. He sat across from her in the firm's conference room, his hands folded, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to do this alone," he said again, his voice softer this time. Aisha shook her head. "I'm not doing anything, Dad. I'm just being." Marcus smiled, a mix of pride and worry. "You're doing more than you think. That video, it's waking people up." He was right. The incident had sparked investigations into the Willow Creek Police Department, uncovering a pattern of complaints against Hargrove and others. Old cases were being re-examined, from traffic stops to arrests, many involving black residents. Aisha's silence had become a catalyst, exposing cracks in a system that had long gone unchallenged. But it came at a cost. Her name was everywhere, her face on every screen. Strangers stopped her in the grocery store, some to thank her, others to glare. She felt the weight of it, but she carried it with the same quiet strength she'd shown on that curb. The confrontation peaked at a town hall meeting that Saturday. The community center was packed, with residents, reporters, and activists spilling into the aisles. Jamal spoke first, his voice a call to action, urging the town to confront its history of division. Hargrove's supporters shouted him down, their voices raw with anger. Aisha sat in the back, unnoticed at first, her presence almost invisible until someone pointed her out. The room turned, every eye on her. She stood, not to speak, but to leave. She didn't need to say anything, her presence was enough. Outside, she found Torres waiting by her car. "Ms. Coleman," he said, his voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." "For what happened?" Aisha studied him, her expression unreadable. "Do better," she said simply, then got into her car and drove away. Torres stood there, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't like Hargrove, but he was part of the same system. And that system was starting to crack. Hargrove's world collapsed in slow motion. By Monday, the Willow Creek Police Department announced his termination, citing conduct unbecoming an officer. The decision came after days of pressure protests, petitions, and a scathing editorial in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that named Aisha's family as a force for change. Hargrove's union fought back, filing a grievance, but public opinion was unrelenting. The video was too clear, Aisha's composure too powerful. He was done. He sat in his apartment, the TV muted but showing his face on a loop. He hadn't slept in days, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking as he scrolled through X. The posts were brutal calls for his arrest, memes mocking him, even threats. His buddies from the precinct had stopped calling, their silence a betrayal he hadn't expected. He'd always thought he was untouchable, a cop in a town where his badge was a shield. But Aisha's silence had stripped that away, exposing him to a world that no longer saw him as a hero. Aisha, meanwhile, was navigating her own storm. The attention hadn't faded. Reporters camped outside her apartment, and her inbox overflowed with interview requests. She declined them all, letting Jamal and her father handle the media. They were naturals, their voices steady and commanding, turning the incident into a rallying cry for reform. But Aisha didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted her life back, her quiet evenings at the diner, her books, her solitude. Yet she knew that wasn't possible anymore. Not yet. She met with a local activist group, not to lead, but to listen. They were planning a march, not just for her, but for every person in Willow Creek who'd faced harassment or worse. Aisha sat in the back, her hands folded, her eyes taking in their passion, their anger, their hope. When they asked her to speak, she shook her head. "You don't need my voice," she said. "You have your own." They pressed her, but she stood firm. Her power wasn't in speeches, it was in her presence, her refusal to bend. The diner reopened, but it wasn't the same. Millie hired extra security, and the crowds were thinner, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Aisha didn't go back. She found a new place to read, a small bookstore with a coffee shop in the back. The owner, a black woman named Lena, recognized her but didn't pry. "You're always welcome here," Lena said, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter. Aisha smiled, the first real smile in days. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Hargrove's final reckoning came at a disciplinary hearing, open to the public due to the case's profile. He sat at a table, his lawyer beside him, facing a panel of city officials. The room was packed, with protesters and supporters on opposite sides, their murmurs a constant hum. Aisha wasn't there, chosen not to attend, letting her statement speak for her. But Jamal was, his presence a reminder of the family Hargrove had underestimated. The panel played the video, the room silent as the coffee splashed across Aisha's blouse, her face unmoved. Hargrove's lawyer argued he'd been provoked, that he'd acted under stress, but the evidence was damning. The panel's decision was unanimous, termination upheld, with a recommendation for further investigation into his conduct. As the gavel fell, Hargrove felt the weight of his actions for the first time. Not guilt, not remorse, but the cold reality of consequences. He'd lost his job, his reputation, his place in the town he'd once ruled. He left the hearing through a back door, avoiding the cameras, the chants, the eyes that followed him. He was a ghost now, invisible in the town he'd called his own. Aisha heard the news from Jamal, who called her as she sat in the bookstore. "It's over," he said, his voice triumphant. Aisha nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Good," she said, and hung up. She turned a page in her book, the words blurring slightly as she exhaled. The storm was passing, but it had changed her, changed Willow Creek, changed everything. The weeks that followed were a reckoning for Willow Creek. The protests didn't stop, they grew, spreading to neighboring towns, each march a demand for accountability. The police department, under scrutiny, announced a review of its policies, with community input sessions scheduled for the first time in years. Aisha's name was a rallying cry, her silence a symbol of resilience. But she stayed out of it, letting others carry the torch. She went back to her routine, her days filled with case files and court documents, her evenings with books and coffee at Lena's bookstore. Hargrove, meanwhile, was a pariah. He'd moved to a neighboring county, hoping to escape the spotlight, but the story followed him. Job applications went unanswered, his name too toxic for any department to touch. He spent his days in a small apartment, the walls bare, the silence oppressive. He avoided avoided the news, but he couldn't avoid the truth. He brought this on himself. The coffee, the taunts, the arrogant side had all been a choice, one he couldn't undo. Aisha's family was a constant presence now. Jamal stayed in town, organizing with local activists, his charisma drawing more people to the cause. Marcus, her father, worked behind the scenes, advising on legal strategies to push for broader reforms. They wanted Aisha to join them, to step into the light, but she refused. "This isn't my fight," she told them one evening over dinner. "It's everyone's." Marcus shook his head, a proud smile on his face. "You started it, though," he said. Aisha didn't argue. She knew he was right, in a way. The town hall meetings continued, each one more heated than the last. Residents who'd stayed silent for years spoke up, sharing stories of harassment, of unfair stops, of a system that protected some and punished others. The stories weren't new, but they were being heard, amplified by the spark Aisha had ignited. Torres, the young officer, started attending, not in uniform, but as a citizen. He listened, his face tight with the weight of what he was learning. He'd always thought he was one of the good ones, but Aisha's words do better echoed in his mind. One evening, Lena invited Aisha to a community reading at the bookstore. It was small, just a dozen people, but it felt like a sanctuary. They read poetry, stories, essays about justice and resilience. Aisha sat in the back, listening as a young girl read a poem about her mother, a black woman who'd faced her own battles in Willow Creek. The girl's voice trembled, but she didn't stop, and when she finished, the room erupted in applause. Aisha clapped too, her eyes shining. For the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger, not as a leader, but as a witness. The diner, once a hub of the town, was struggling. Millie put it up for sale, unable to handle the backlash. Aisha heard the news and felt a pang of sadness, not for the place, but for what it had represented, a small piece of normalcy, now tainted. She drove by one evening, the neon sign dark, the parking lot empty. The wooden sign from that night was gone, but she could still see it in her mind. The words "Justice Waits" silently burned into her memory. Hargrove's lawyer reached out to Aisha, offering a settlement to avoid a lawsuit. She declined, not because she wanted to fight, but because she didn't need his money. The damage was done, not to her, but to him. She'd already won, not by shouting or suing, but by standing her ground. Her silence had spoken louder than any courtroom could. As spring turned to summer, Willow Creek began to heal. The protests grew smaller, more focused, turning into community forums where people talked instead of shouted. A new police chief was appointed, a woman from Atlanta with a reputation for reform. She reached out to Aisha, asking for her input. Aisha met with her, not to lead, but to share what she'd seen, what she'd felt. "Start with trust," Aisha said. "It's the only way." The chief nodded, taking notes. Aisha's life settled into a new rhythm. She still read at Lena's, still worked at the firm, still kept to herself. But she carried something Newa quiet pride, not in what she'd done, but in what she'd shown others they could do. She'd stood still, and the world had moved around her. The summer brought change to Willow Creek. Subtle but undeniable. The police department's review led to new training programs, with a focus on de-escalation and bias awareness. Torres was one of the first to sign up, his face serious as he sat through sessions led by community leaders. He thought of Aisha every time, her calm eyes challenging him to be better. The town's wounds were still raw, but they were starting to scar over, stronger than before. Aisha's family remained a force. Jamal launched a nonprofit to support grassroots reform, naming it Silent Strength in her honor. Aisha didn't attend the launch, but she sent a note, "Keep going." Marcus took on pro bono cases for Willow Creek residents, helping them navigate complaints against the police. Their work was loud, visible, a contrast to Aisha's quiet resolve. But it was her spark that kept them going, her refusal to break that fueled their fight. Hargrove was a shadow now, living on the edges of a nearby town. He'd found work as a security guard, a far cry from the power he'd once wielded. He avoided Willow Creek, avoided the diner, avoided anyone who might recognize him. But he couldn't avoid his thoughts. At night, he'd sit in his dim apartment, replaying the moment he'd poured that coffee. He didn't feel sorry, not exactly. But he felt something close to regret, a gnawing sense that he'd miscalculated, that he'd underestimated the woman he'd tried to humiliate. Aisha found her own peace in small moments. She started a book club at Lena's, a quiet space where people read and talked about stories that mattered. They read Baldwin, Morrison, Hurston, voices that had shaped Aisha's own. The group grew, drawing people from all corners of Willow Creek, black and white, young and old. They didn't talk about the incident, didn't need to. It was in the air, in the way they listened to each other, in the way they rebuilt trust one conversation at a time. The diner was bought by a young couple from Atlanta, who turned it into a community hub. They painted the walls with murals of local history, including a small panel of a woman sitting on a curb, her face calm, her blouse stained. The caption read, "She stood still, and we moved." Aisha saw it one day when she passed by, and for the first time, she didn't look away. She smiled, then kept walking. The national spotlight faded, but the changes in Willow Creek endured. The new police chief implemented community patrols, pairing officers with residents to rebuild trust. Torres was a regular, walking the streets, listening more than he spoke. He saw Aisha once, at the bookstore, and nodded to her. She nodded back, a small acknowledgement that felt like a bridge. One evening, Aisha sat with Lena, sipping coffee as the sun set. "You changed this town," Lena said, her voice soft. Aisha shook her head. "I didn't change it. I just stayed." Lena laughed, a warm sound that filled the room. "That's enough, Aisha. That's more than enough." Aisha looked out the window, the sky painted with streaks of pink and gold. She thought of her mother, of her words about silence and screams. She'd been right. Hargrove's story ended quietly. He moved again, farther away, his name fading from the headlines. He'd never faced criminal charges. The evidence didn't meet the threshold, but he'd lost everything that mattered. His badge, his pride, his place. He was a cautionary tale now, a reminder of what happens when power is wielded without care. Aisha's story, though, was just beginning. She wasn't a leader, wasn't a speaker, wasn't a fighter in the way her family was. But she was a force, her silence a mirror that forced others to see themselves. She kept reading, kept working, kept living. And in her quiet way, she kept changing the world. By fall, Willow Creek felt different. The protests had quieted, replaced by community forums where residents spoke openly about race, trust, and healing. The police department's reforms were taking root, with officers like Torres leading by example, their presence less about control and more about connection. The town wasn't perfect. Tensions lingered. Old divides still simmered, but it was trying. And that was enough for now. Aisha's book club became a cornerstone of the town's new rhythm. Every Thursday, people gathered at Lena's, their voices weaving stories of struggle and hope. Aisha rarely spoke, but when she did, the room listened. Her words were few but heavy, each one carrying the weight of her experience. She didn't talk about the incident, didn't need to. It was part of her now, a chapter in a story she was still writing. Her family visited often, their presence a reminder of the legacy she carried. Jamal's nonprofit grew, funding scholarships for local youth and training programs for officers. Marcus took on a case against a neighboring department, his name still a force in courtrooms across Georgia. They were proud of Aisha, not for what she'd done, but for who she was. "You're the strongest of us," Jamal told her one evening, his voice soft. Aisha just smiled, stirring her tea. "I'm just me," she said. The diner, now called Unity Cafe, thrived under its new owners. The murals drew tourists, and the coffee was better than ever. Aisha went back once, on a quiet afternoon, and sat at the counter. The young owner, a woman named Maya, recognized her and slid a slice of pecan pie across the counter. "On the house," Maya said, her eyes warm. Aisha nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her book. She felt at home, not because of the place, but because of what it represented, a town that was learning to listen. Hargrove was gone, a footnote in Willow Creek's history. He'd tried to rebuild, taking odd jobs, but his name was a stain he couldn't wash out. He didn't understand it, not fully why one moment, one cup of coffee, had cost him everything. But he felt it, the weight of his own choices, heavy as the silence Aisha had wielded against him. The town's healing was slow, but it was real. Schools started teaching about local history, including the ugly parts. Community leaders, inspired by Aisha, organized voter drives, ensuring voices once ignored were heard. The police chief met with residents monthly, her door always open. Torres was promoted, not for heroism, but for consistency, for showing up and listening. He kept Aisha's words in his pocket, a quiet reminder, do better. One evening, as the leaves turned gold, Aisha walked through Willow Creek's park, her book under her arm. The air was crisp, the sky clear. She sat on a bench, watching kids play, their laughter a sound of hope. A young girl ran up, her braids bouncing, and handed Aisha a flower. "You're the lady from the video," the girl said, her eyes wide. Aisha smiled, tucking the flower into her book. "I'm just Aisha," she said. The girl grinned and ran off, her laughter echoing. Aisha opened her book, the pages worn but cherished. She read, the words a comfort, a reminder of who she was. She wasn't a hero, wasn't a martyr. She was a woman who'd sat still when the world tried to break her, who'd let her silence speak. And in that silence, she'd found her strength, her voice, her truth. Willow Creek would never be the same, and neither would she. But as she turned the page, Aisha knew one thing for certain. She was enough. And that was everything.